Welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast with me, Jonathon Shafi, and joined this week by our Head of Policy and Research at the think tank, Dr. Craig Dalzell. Craig, it's great to be back. I know I've been away for a few weeks. How are you getting on?
Yeah, good to hear from you. As regular listeners know, we've had a wealth of really good podcasts while you've been away, several very good guest speakers as well. And not taking away from anything from yourself, Shafi, but some of the conversations we've been having have been excellent conversations around waste incineration and on land reform, and getting some experts in their field to talk about what's happening and how Scotland can be better. So highly encourage people to not just listen to this week's episode, but to go back a few weeks and listen to some of the catalogue as well.
Well, a break from my dulcet tones is probably to the good, to be honest, for the podcast. But I am actually living next to a construction zone at the present moment. So if you do hear any of that go in the background, I do apologise. The window is closed. There's nothing else I can do about it. But talking about construction and talking about building, as we've talked about so many times on this podcast, Craig, over the last year or so, we face a huge task in terms of rebuilding from the pandemic. We face a really substantial, in many ways unprecedented economic challenge. And that comes in the back of a decade of austerity. So there's lots to discuss. There's lots to do, more importantly. And as we know, Common Weal have created a fantastic policy platform addressing all of the issues over the years, and a really important bit of work around resilient Scotland in terms of rebuilding from the pandemic and building towards independence. But recently, we launched another initiative under the banner Better Than This. And this was an intervention, I suppose, into the election. But for listeners that maybe haven't seen it, and we'll link to it below the podcast, maybe just give us an overview of the concept of the Better Than This initiative.
Yeah, so front up, Common Weal remains a non-party think tank. We're not affiliated to any political party. We're not endorsing any particular political party. The relationship's quite the opposite. We lobby all of the political parties in Scotland to try and get them to adopt our policies. And we'll talk a bit more about how successful we've been in recent months as we go through the podcast. But this paper was our early intervention into the elections that are coming up next month at the start of May, where we put out 8 things that we wanted to see people talk about in this election. We did this before any of the manifestos came out and before a lot of the headlines came out. So this gives us an opportunity to say what we want from this election and allows us to then judge the political parties based on what they're offering, and to see just how influential we have been and how closely they have been listening to our ideas. So our 8 big ideas, and you'll have heard many of them being talked about on the podcast over the past year or so. The first one is a resilient recovery. This follows our Resilient Scotland plan to come out of this pandemic safely, and to do so permanently, right? Not to go back into cycles of lockdowns, and then to start preparing for the Green New Deal to come, to start using this coming Parliament to do everything that Scotland can to start preparing for that Green New Deal. Even though we can't do everything quite yet, do everything we can do and prepare to do everything else. Idea 2 is the Green New Deal itself. That is the planet is facing an existential crisis with the climate emergency. We need to be doing everything we can to avert the worst of that. Idea 3 is a new democracy. We've talked about this several times on the podcast. Scotland has the worst level of local democracy of any country in Europe. Even England has better local democracy than Scotland has via its parish councils. So we need a local democracy that is worthy of the name, that anywhere else in Europe would call normal, but would look to us like a radical shift in the way we do politics here. Next up is a national care service. You've heard many parties talking about this, and they're going down somewhat different paths of what that would mean. But really, for us, that means a national care service to do social care the way that we do health with the National Health Service. So national infrastructure, locally run services, and free at the point of use. Next up is land reform. As I said, we talked about this on the podcast 2 weeks ago. What does Scotland look like if we actually fundamentally change the way we own the land under our feet? And what can we do with it once we take control of the country that is ours, all of ours? Next up, one of the biggest things that we need to do ahead of the Green New Deal is fix our housing sector. And it's not just about making things more efficient. It is about changing the building materials we use to make everything more sustainable. It's about building houses from the start to be better, to be built to Green New Deal standards of energy efficiency and zero carbon energy use. But it's also about helping people who are trapped in a death spiral of a private renting sector. By instituting things like rent controls to ease that burden and restore power to tenants. The next idea is energy. Again, a very Green New Deal policy, but again, fundamental to everything else we do. If the lights go out, nothing works. So we need a national energy company, one that doesn't just feed energy to consumers and compete with the big six on the market, but one that actually owns our energy structure. There was news this week that Amazon is starting to invest in Scottish renewable assets. Amazon of all people, because presumably they can get cheaper electricity that way, but also maybe that they're looking to create another monopoly in the renewable energy sector. We're not quite sure yet, but the fundamental point is we have massive multinational corporations buying up Scottish assets, and they're able to do that because we haven't nationalised them like virtually every other country does. So that's idea 7. Idea 8, better banking. Our local economies have been squeezed through this pandemic with everything from us not being able to go to the high street to shop to even things like a lot of shops no longer accepting cash or highly discouraging cash, which is extremely discriminatory to folk who are more vulnerable to that kind of thing, who aren't as embedded in the digital financial infrastructure as some others are. We're not ready to go to a cashless economy, and I don't even think there's been a really good argument to say that we should go that way entirely. So we need to bring banking back into communities that have been left without basic financial infrastructure. And then finally, that was idea 8. Finally, a kind of bonus idea is we remain a pro-independence think tank. We support independence. Many parties fighting this election do support independence, but we're calling for independence to be done right. We can't slide into an independence that leaves us without the institutions that we need to run a viable nation state. I've still seen Scottish Government ministers talking about the transition to an independent Scottish currency being done under the terms of the 2018 Growth Commission that we have spent many episodes on the podcast dismantling and showing how the 6 tests that they have set up are designed to fail, designed to prevent a transition to a Scottish currency, not to facilitate the transition to one. So we need to get that infrastructure in place as much as possible ahead of independence, and once we become independent, we need to do it right, and we need to use that power to then do everything else in the list above that we haven't been able to do with the powers of devolution.
Well, what a fantastic overview there from Craig. Yep, take a breath. But it does show you both the extent of the kind of policy ambition that Common Weal has got, but it also shows you the scale of the challenge. And at the same time, it shows you that lots of the problems that we face and are going to face do actually have policy consequences, but also policy alternatives. And we're going to take a look through a number of the issues that have been raised so far in the election campaign. Just before we do that, though, just on your last point, it seems to me to be completely untenable to argue that going through an economic crisis of the scale that we're going through and going to go through, to do so without a central bank would be extremely, it's not just that it would be difficult, it would be impossible in my view to orientate the economy to intervene in the way that you would require. So, we've talked about that a lot, but it still is an issue. Kate Forbes was discussing this in the BBC and still cited the 6 tests. And as Craig has neatly outlined there, those 6 tests are designed to fail. They won't be met. So you're in a very perilous situation economically. So we've covered that in some detail, so we won't go too much into that from here on. We want to focus on some of the policy output that we've seen from the political parties, and we'll look at all the parties and all their offerings. But Craig, is there anything that's kind of caught your eye in terms of the manifestos? Any sort of initial comments you want to make about, if not directly the manifestos, but the state of the debate, the state of the policy discussion so far in the election?
Well, I have to say, in terms of the politics of the election, I'm a bit less interested in that than a lot of other people are, simply because I am that policy-headed person. I'm less interested in the personalities. I'm less interested in the leaders' debates and the who won which argument somewhere. I'm more interested in saying, right, what do you want to do? How are you going to do it? And when are you going to do it? So I'm always looking beneath those headlines. And I was prepared for this to be quite a boring election from that perspective, in the sense that there was a lot of drive towards the personalities involved in the various sides of this debate. But actually, now that the manifestos have come out, there have been some interesting policies, and more importantly than that, there's been a massively broad crossover of policies among the parties. Now, everyone saying the same thing might not sound immediately exciting to folk on the outside, but when you realise that some of the policies that people are talking about were radical to the point of laughable less than a decade ago, just a few years ago, and are now being cited by multiple mainstream political parties in Scotland, is quite amazing. A big example of that is universal basic income. So the universal basic income is now supported by 4 out of the 5 parties who had at least one seat in the previous parliament. The only party that opposes a universal basic income out of that group are the Conservatives. Every other party, the SNP, Lib Dems, Labour, the Greens, they all support a universal basic income. They all know that we can't do one right now. Scotland doesn't have the powers to initiate one right now. What we'd need to do is either get some rule changes and some more cooperation from the DWP and the HMRC to facilitate a universal basic income, or we need independence so we can just do it ourselves. It has been interesting that at least 2 parties have now suggested a workaround in the form of a minimum income guarantee. This was something that I brought up in my 2017 paper in looking at potential options for social security in an independent Scotland. I did support and actually modelled a universal basic income in that paper, but I also looked at something that akin to a minimum income guarantee that could be done with the powers of devolution, that would guarantee, even if you were out of work, you would get a certain amount of income, and it would taper off as you started earning, in the same way that your income does as you're taxed. So it's really interesting to see that idea now starting to come into the discourse. And I've been talking to other UBI proponents in Scotland, and all of them are kind of amazed now that UBI is now a when, not if policy in Scotland.
Well, that's one example of where we've seen a lot of progress. And I know there's various debates about UBI, isn't there? Because UBI alone isn't some kind of magic wand to solve the fundamental problems with how the economy interacts with working people's lives and all the rest of it. I'd like actually just to make just a quick comment on that before we move on, just because I think it's important to have some context to that debate, that you see UBI is coming alongside a sort of package of measures.
I mean, it's possible to do universal basic income in a way that would be quite abhorrent to folk who are on the left of politics. There is a very right-wing version of UBI, a libertarian version of UBI, that says that government shouldn't provide any services at all, not even education and healthcare. What it should do instead is give everybody vouchers to go out and buy those services from the private market. So you can imagine a UBI designed to try and reduce the state and push everything to some hyper-capitalism version of the economy. And that is something that certainly from my personal politics and your politics and the politics in general of the left would be quite abhorrent. So yes, you do need to back that UBI up with a strong sense of universal basic services as well. And this is again something that several of the parties like the SNP and the Greens have been advocating, having that basic safety net of things that shouldn't be part of the market. So healthcare, education, people expect them to be available. They shouldn't have to go out and try and auction off their options among various companies to provide them education. You can extend that to, in Scotland, water is considered a universal basic service. Care is getting to the point where it should be a universal basic service in the form of a national care service. So having that strong welfare state, that strong sense of social security is really important alongside a UBI. And also alongside, market interventions. Like we've seen papers come out this week on a job guarantee scheme, another idea I was talking about back in 2017 in my social security paper, where instead of going to the job centre and filling out your little diary of the jobs that you have applied for, and if you do well enough, you might get some money to see you through to the next fortnight. Instead, the government would have a responsibility of providing you with a job. If you want to work, you can work. Here's a list of jobs that we think you're capable of doing and that need done. Now, I don't see that as a social security, but I do see it as very powerful economic policy, something that can be used to transition people into the Green New Deal, for instance.
Exactly, and I'm going to ask you questions about the SNP and the Greens manifesto, but I did want to turn to the Labour question, because Anas Sarwar obviously taken over from Richard Leonard. What's your impression been, not of the personalities, but from a policy perspective? The Labour Party, Scottish Labour, have gone big, as you would expect, on the question of recovery from the pandemic and their sort of national plan to address some issues. Now, from what you've seen so far, what's your comment on that?
Now, as we're recording this on Wednesday the 21st, the Labour Manifesto hasn't been published yet. It was delayed until the 22nd, so it's going to come out tomorrow as we record this. But we have seen hints and, again, headlines and trailers of what they're coming out with. They do seem to be very positive on something like a national care service, and maybe going further than the SNP are in that respect. In fact, the previous Labour leader, Richard Leonard, described one of our papers on national care as the most important policy paper published last year. So that was I'll link to that one. That was Nick Kemp's paper, looking at the effect of the pandemic on care homes and how that could have been avoided. We have seen other hints of perhaps where Labour could be going quite strong. I've had a good relationship with Pauline McNeill, the Labour MSP, and her fight for rent controls. I don't know, her bill to try and get a rent control system in Scotland fell because it was basically timed out. If you have a bill going through Parliament and you reach the end of Parliament and it hasn't been passed, then it simply just ends there and you have to reintroduce it in the next parliamentary session. So that does give an opportunity to address some of the maybe the weaknesses of that bill, or beef up the strength, or just change it to adjust with the times. So I don't know quite what's going to be in the Labour Manifesto about rent controls and about housing, but I would expect from the noises I'm hearing around the activists and the headlines that they could be going quite strong in that. So yeah, we as I say, it's interesting that a lot of these ideas that Common Weal has been talking about for years are now feeding themselves into various parties. Just to stick on housing again, things like building regulations. We have said that, from today we need to be building to Green New Deal standards, because every house we build that isn't at those standards will have to be retrofitted, and it will cost a lot more to retrofit than to just build the houses properly from the start. Now, the SNP have been fairly weak on this. They're still going with a plan of just slowly ramping up building regulations. The Conservatives are arguing that maybe we should do that, but a little bit faster. The other parties, the Greens certainly, and the Lib Dems have been saying that we should be building to Green New Deal standards today. So they're going a lot stronger on that. Again, it'll be interesting to see if Labour take that approach, or whether they take one that's a bit closer to the ask for, or the offer from the SNP and the Tories.
Well, the Greens certainly seem to be having a decent enough election. If you look at the opinion polls, it looks like they could achieve a record number of seats in the Scottish Parliament, up to 10 seats. I think that's the top that I've seen in terms of the possibilities. But we don't know what will happen over the next few weeks. As we know with the electoral system, the way it works, it could be fractions of votes which determine on the list how well, in fact, the Greens do in the end. But in terms of their policy platform, in terms of the issues that they've been raising and their manifesto in its totality, I would assume that there's lots of good policies in there, and lots of policies where Common Weal would be very encouraged by.
Again, for full disclosure, for folk who maybe don't know, I am a member of the Scottish Green Party, so I have my biases there. But speaking with my Common Weal hat on and trying to be again as objective and as fair as possible, I did like a lot of what was in that manifesto, especially on again the call for universal basic income, the call for better housing, the call for a transition to a circular economy in the Green Manifesto was probably the strongest out of the manifestos we've seen, although probably not strong enough. This is becoming a little bit of a bugbear of mine, that every party has been calling for a circular economy as part of the fight against the climate emergency. The circular economy even made it into the Conservative manifesto. But I'm not convinced that politicians really understand what a circular economy is. Now, we've talked about it on the podcast, we've got papers on it. It was a big part of our Common Home Plan, our Green New Deal proposal. What it is not is the same linear economy that we have, except with a bit more recycling, or except with a few tool libraries here and there to ease the pressure. It is about tool libraries, it is about recycling, but it's about a lot more than that. It's a fundamental restructuring of the way we manufacture goods, the way we use goods, and the way we dispose of them. It's so much bigger than just a recycling target, and I'm really not seeing that from any of the manifestos, that people really understand how big a transition it actually is.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things about manifestos, it's often like policies which are passed at party conferences and so on. First of all, you're never quite sure how much understanding there is around the issues in question at the kind of level that you're talking about. Political parties, they love to have words that they can say that sound popular and interesting, but when it comes to actual implementation, you can often see all kinds of problems along the way. So it's interesting that you see that in relation to the kind of circular economy stuff. But turning to the SNP, they've had a manifesto packed full of pledges, of spending pledges, of ideas and initiatives around rebuilding from the pandemic. I'm going to put this to you and get your comment on it. My view about that manifesto was that of course, there's a lot of proposals, but it does seem to me to lack any sort of semblance of a serious industrial strategy. And it seems to me that that's going to be absolutely central to rebuilding over the next few years. But with that comment of my own, sort of pass over to you, Craig, and your thoughts really on the SNP platform.
I'd agree with that, and something that I often look for in manifestos is, what is the story you're trying to tell? It's easy to take a patchwork of individual policies and just kind of throw them up all on a page, but yeah, it's the difference between investing in some key industries here and there, or putting a pot of money up for people to bid on, and actually having an industrial strategy, having a goal in mind that you are trying to work towards. And again, it's hard work to do that because it's hard work to do it well, because it's not just about telling that story, it's then going back and saying how you would get there. So that's something really that people should be judging all of the manifestos on, not just the SNP one when you come to cast your vote, is, you know, what is the end goal? If all these policies, all these promises come to fruition, where does the country actually end up, and is that a place you want to go to?
Yeah, really interesting. Let's just talk more broadly then, because we've talked about lots of the independents supporting parties there in terms of the SNP and the Greens. We've had some discussion about Labour. Obviously, Alba has entered the election and are, I suppose, an untested force, but lots of controversy around the organisation, not least because it's being led by Alex Salmond. From a policy perspective, I did note that their manifesto contained a message around the Scottish National Investment Bank and how that might be best utilised and deployed. So I wondered if you could just say a few words just about that, and I suppose in general the role of the National Investment Bank going forward in this next period.
As with all of the other manifestos, there are a lot of Common Weal policies in that manifesto that are worthy of looking at, and things like around the National Investment Bank, which I believe they are calling for to be a lot more powerful than it is, to up the capitalisation, to allow it to have more access to money, to be able to do all these things that they want it to do, is a worthy goal, and it's something that we've called for as well. Ideally, we would like the UK Treasury to give the SNIB dispensation from being a state bank and allow it to be an independent, arm's length but nationally owned bank, in a similar way to RBS, really. Or NatWest now, which, not to run it like that retail bank, but to allow it to start issuing bonds in its own right, to allow it to start borrowing money or to attract investment money from, say, pension funds, rather than just being reliant on the money that the Scottish Government can give it, which is the case now. Because the SNIB is a very ambitious project, and it has a lot of missions to cover, and it's got a lot of potential projects that it could get involved in, but it doesn't have nearly enough money to do any of them. It cannot complete any one of its missions with the capital that it has, never mind all of them. So if we want a SNIB worthy of the name, it needs to be given the powers to do that. So it's good to see that call starting to come through.
Okay, and that leaves us with the Lib Dems and the Tories, I think that some of the stuff that you've talked about, everyone wants to appear as if they're somewhat to the left of centre because of the scale of intervention that's going to be required in terms of what's coming at us down the line. But I did look at the Tory tax policy. You look at how that would impact among the most richest and most well-paid people in Scotland, and how it would affect those on the other end of the spectrum. And you find that effectively you're getting a tax cut if you're very well off.
Yeah, the Conservatives are in an interesting position in Scotland, because they're always calling for the Scottish Government to use the powers it has before it starts demanding any more. And yet what they are actually saying that they would do with the powers is to not use them. They want to, their solution to their proposal for the powers that Scotland has over income tax is to use them to harmonise Scotland's income tax rates with the UK's, and effectively to have the same tax rate as is set by London. They've also said the same about air passenger duty. They want to ensure that air passenger duty is kept at the same rate in Scotland as it is in the rest of the UK, without mentioning what Boris Johnson wants to do is cut air passenger duty. And we've written papers about how terrible that would be as an idea. So it's almost like that they want to get into power to not do anything. Again, they have mentioned some things that Common Weal has talked about. I mentioned about the circular economy, but you're right, they have kind of said the words, but not really said what they want to do with it. So, yeah, the Conservatives, let's just say they're probably not the most Common Weal friendly of parties. But as I say, I'm always willing to be surprised. If any of them want to talk to me about some of our policies, then we are a non-party think tank, and I will talk to any party. On the Lib Dem side of things, their manifesto had some interesting points in it. I shouldn't have been surprised that they were against a national care service, and they are. They sort of welcome the recommendations that have come in with the Feely review and some of the noises that have been made about reform of the care service, but they're against a unified national care service. On the grounds, on very liberal grounds of being against the potential increase in bureaucracy that could mean. They don't want to see that. They cite the unification of Police Scotland as their objection against a national care service, which makes me kind of wonder if they would have the same objections if someone was proposing a national health service today for the first time. But on the other side, as I say, they came out very strongly in favour of a housing revolution of almost exactly the kind that we have been asking for. So passive house construction, zero energy construction. One of the few parties that is talking about expansive use of district heating to heat our homes in the Green New Deal. It's the hardest solution to install because of the amount of infrastructure you need to put in. But once you have installed a district heating system, and once you've done it right, it offers the best potential for high quality heat that's decarbonised and is future proof in the way that, for example, electric heat pumps are not, because they tie you into the price of electricity. So, the Lib Dems did throw up a surprise in that respect. They really picked up our not just our individual policies around building regs and decarbonised heating, but really knitted it together in a way that I haven't seen from many of the other parties.
And just lastly, Craig, there are a couple of other parties that I just wanted to raise because they're also been part of the discussion, at least to some extent. And I'm not saying that you've read from back to front George Galloway's manifesto, the Alliance for Unity, but that seems to be a very light on policy from what I've seen. But I just wondered if you had any comment on that. And the other party that I noticed is on your blog, as listed in terms of its policy platform, is the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition, who's standing as well. So it was just if you had any kind of last comments on any of these, or indeed any other parties that we may have missed.
You offend me. Of course I've read them. I'm that sad of an individual.
Well, take it as a backhanded compliment that I didn't think that you'd sat down and read all of the George Galloway manifesto. But nevertheless, it is in the election, and I would be interested in any comments you've got.
It is interesting that there is a crowded field here. Once you get beyond the incumbent parties who were in the Parliament before. You get down into the more minor parties and the new parties like the Alba Party, who are trying to get over that de facto threshold we have in Scottish politics. Mm-hmm. The way that the Scottish election system is set up, unlike a lot of proportional voting systems around Europe, we don't have a formal threshold. In Germany, you must get at least 5% of the vote before you get any seats in the Parliament. If you get less than 5%, you're just not eligible for any. In Scotland, we don't have that. But the way that our system is set up, really, you do need about 5.5%, 6% of the vote in a single region before the maths allows you to get that first seat. And politics being what it is, there aren't very many parties who have a concentration in a single region and no vote share outside of that region. So you tend to find if you're not polling around 5% in the national polls, it's unlikely you will get any seats in the Parliament. Nevertheless, you do have half a dozen or more parties who are polling in the 1 or 2% on a good day in the elections. And we might get a dark horse election. We might see some of these people enter Parliament. I quite enjoy a diverse parliament. I would quite like to see another so-called rainbow parliament of a lot of diverse views and coalitions forming either permanently or around certain issues, because it's more exciting to me than a majority parliament that can just whip through everything they want to do. Will any of these minor parties get through? Well, you yourself have experience of how hard that is, especially if you're a new party trying to make a mark on the scene for the very first time.
Yeah, I think all of the new parties will face some difficulties for all of the obvious reasons. But we'll see what the makeup of the Parliament is very soon. The election, of course, on the 6th of May. And the way they're counting at this time, it will be probably a day or two after that we get the results. And we'll come back and we'll assess the makeup of the Parliament, and we'll do so from a perspective of how can we get the best and most progressive policies through that Parliament in order to transform the lives of millions of ordinary people right across Scotland. That is, after all, what we are set up to do, and we believe we've got a really solid platform when it comes to our policy to do that. And it is really interesting to see a whole range of parties that have engaged with our policy production, and as Craig has said, we want to work with any of the parties who do want to progress any of our policy agenda, and to do so in a really open and constructive way. So with that said, I do want to end on a note which I believe is not only much more exciting, but in my opinion much happier, because I'll be honest with you, Craig, I haven't been particularly enthused by this election. I've to be honest, been more demoralised by it than anything else for all sorts of reasons which we won't get into here. However, to end on a very positive note, Craig, I believe you want to share some news with the listeners.
Yeah, so you'll be happy to hear I will not be on the podcast for the next fortnight. Yeah, I'm taking a short break from the podcast. I'm going to be leaving things in your capable hands, Jonathan, and
very capable.
The hands of some of our other colleagues at Common Weal. I'm taking a short break because I'm away to get married. So
well, isn't that just that is actually some good news? And to be honest, it's about the best news that I've had over the last few months, because it has been very difficult. So it is great to hear some really good news. So congratulations to you, Craig. Not just from me, but from everyone at Common Weal. I don't know if people. I mean, people will know because of the amount of policy that is produced. But Craig's role at the organisation is just insurmountable. Huge amounts of work that Craig puts in, and so it's great to see that you're getting married, and it'll be a very happy and special occasion. And all of us here at the think tank, and I'm sure all of our loyal listeners as well, will be really pleased to hear that. So, with that said, we hope you've enjoyed our kind of mapping of all of the manifestos that have come out so far. We'll see what the next couple of weeks brings, and as I say, after the election, we'll come back, we'll have an assessment for what it means for policy at the domestic level in the devolved settlement, but also what it means for the progress of Scottish independence as well. And with that, I'll be back next week.